Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining my talk today. I am Dr. Rita Okoroafor, currently an assistant professor at Texas A&M University. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you what I've learned about the relevance of petroleum and geoscience skills in the evolving energy mix. So let me start with a little story. I decided to go for my PhD in geothermal energy after about 13 years in the oil and gas industry. And my advisor asked me to take a course on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. When I looked at the contents of the course and I even took a peep at what the homework would look like, I decided I wasn't going to do that course. I was going to run away. And it so happened that the alternative course I wanted to take in place of the CCUS course was clashing with the core requirement because I needed to take that quarter. So I was left with no choice than to take the course on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Well, it turned out that that happened to be one of my best courses during my PhD. I learned a lot, but what was more exciting was the fact that I could apply everything I had learned as a petroleum engineer to understand and to practice things related to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. In addition, after my PhD, when I was doing a postdoc and I was involved in projects related to CCUS and underground hydrogen storage, it's the same oil and gas skills that are brought in to help me understand and also to advance knowledge. So what I'm sharing with you today is not theory. It's something that I know for a fact. And please listen, grab as much points as you want, and feel free to ask me any questions related to the skills that we need for the energy mix. So the agenda I will take today, I will just give an introduction. I will talk about where we are with regards to the evolving energy mix and talk about the kind of pathways to decarbonization. Then I will talk about the ERP exploration and production value chain and the related skills that we have been utilizing in this system. Then I would move on to other value chains with examples of how the skills of the oil and gas industry are being used or applied in this different spaces. In the interest of time, I wouldn't cover everything, but if you have any questions related to anything that I haven't mentioned here, but you feel is relevant, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to share a petroleum and geoscience skill transfer map, competency map. We'll just talk about it briefly, how I went about developing it with a few of my colleagues, and then I'll summarize. Okay. So on this slide, I show here the evolving energy mix starting from the 1800s. And what we know about this data and about this figure is that we have been seeing different changes in the energy mix, what's been required to provide energy over the years. Secondly, what's also outstanding is the fact that there's a growth in the demand for energy as we see it. So this keeps growing steeply as we take our cumulative. And we also see when we expand into the most recent years that there's been some changes here and there. We're beginning to see some things related to the renewables growing. Okay, so that's what we see with the evolving energy mix. The main drivers in the past for the changes in the energy resources we use have been cost and abundance, but more recently, it has been towards how do we use sources that reduce carbon, CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. We are thinking about sources that are more sustainable. We think about energy security, getting energy resources where we are. And so these are many of the drivers for the evolving energy mix we are seeing. Many mention the word the energy transition because we're moving from one thing to the other. But as we'll see in the next slide, we will continue to see a mix of the different sources of energy. So this is a slide taken out of ExxonMobil website that looks a bit ahead to what we would anticipate in terms of the energy mix. What we see, this is a forecast, you know, nobody knows the future perfectly, but this is a forecast. And what we see is that there's going to be oil, natural gas, renewables, hydrogen, nuclear playing a role in meeting the demands for energy. We do observe that that the forecast shows the growth in renewable energy, wind and solar and other renewable energy. We see the role of natural gas in the energy mix, but we still observe that there's going to be that mix of different sources of energy, okay? So with that in mind, we now begin to think of how have people been addressing the issue of decarbonization, trying to, you know, why have we been seeing these changes in the energy mix? And so there are different pathways to decarbonization. And what I show here is because decarbonization is not only something that is attributed to the electricity sector or the heat and cooling sector. We see it in different industries. We see it in agriculture. We see it in different sectors. And so the different pathways to decarbonization are looking at how do we address greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions at different stages in different sectors. So we look at the way we are doing our buildings. We think of how can we improve it? How do we change our appliances to be more energy efficient? How do we change our vehicles to be using more energy efficient fuels? So these are some of the pathways. When we think about methane emissions and gas flaring, there are several ways in which people are addressing how to reduce emissions, fugitive emissions, venting, and flaring. So these are some other pathways to which we try to do decarbonization. So when I speak about decarbonization, it's not only CO2 I'm referring to, I'm also including greenhouse gases in the mix, okay? We do know that trees that are felled, deforestation causes an increase in CO2 in the environment. And so changes in land use are some of the ways in which we address the decarbonization through afforestation and through improved grazing management. Then we begin to look at carbon capture, utilization, and storage. How do we capture the CO2 that is generated through power plants, through cement industry, you know, through different things that processes we do, hydrogen production, etc. And so there are several approaches to it. I can't list all of them here, but we have the direct air capture. We have the utilization of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, EOR. We have the carbon capture and storage, CCS, where we put the CO2 in geologic, under the subsurface in geologic systems, or even in the ocean. We have mineralization. There's CO2 plume geothermal, CPG, where we use the CO2 to generate electricity. And there are several industries that continue to utilize CO2 for their operations. Then we talk about fuel switching, where we consider using a different fuel or energy source that doesn't emit as much carbon as traditional sources, let's say, for instance, coal or even oil. And so we think about hydrogen, we think about solar, we think about wind. And then the concept of electrification is moving away from using fuels, but using electricity. So we would have electricity and battery-driven vehicles and things like that. But in my talk today, I'm going to focus my examples around the carbon capture, utilization and storage, hydrogen, renewable energy sources, and how the skills and someone from the oil and gas industry has can be utilized in those areas. To put things in context, I'm going to start with the exploration and production value chain so that we just put it at the back of our mind as we're moving forward. When we look at the upstream, which is where most of the skills that when we talk about the oil and gas industry, that's where we really focus on. We talk about the exploration part of things. We're looking at the geology, the geophysics, seismic acquisition, exploratory drilling, and then we begin to think about the development and production towards the later stage when we have identified fields that are, what's developing. And so we bring in the reservoir engineering, production engineering, and drilling, completions, etc. Midstream, we deal with the pipeline transportation, storage, distribution. Downstream, we think about the processing, the blending, and then the distribution. So this is, in a broad scale, what we see in the value chain for the exploration and production cycle. So what kind of skills do we have in this part of things? On the upstream part, we see the geosciences, the drilling, engineering, reservoir engineering, petrophysics, completion, production, engineering and operations, projects and facilities. But not only are these skills needed, we also need some other non-core technical skills. I just call them non-core because in the context of this is the petroleum engineering or oil and gas industry, they are not what we would go and study per se in school, but they are add-ons to help us to develop this industry, without which the industry would not really flourish as it's doing so. So we have things like petroleum economics, we have things like supply chain, contract management, we have the legal, we have the digital technologies, we have the instrumentations, we have public and government affairs, human resources, international relationships, etc. So there's a host of all these other technical skills which we need added on to the core petroleum and geoscience skills for the oil and gas industry. So how do these skills translate to different aspects of our evolving energy mix? And let me bring in a few examples, okay? On this slide, I show what it takes, up to the stage of trying to develop a project in the oil and gas industry, and I contrast that with the geothermal industry as well as the wind and solar industry. This is just in the stage of trying to get permits to start the work of developing the resource. And we see that there's a lot of similarities between the oil and gas industry and the geothermal industry. While not so much in the wind and solar, but we still need to go through the process of permitting. We still need to go to the process of site selection, resource management, and site characterization. And these are things that are done in the oil and gas industry. So the first case I'll talk about is the site selection for a solar PV power plant. It could also be the site selection for a solar power plant, even if it was not PV, if it was something like the concentrated power plants, concentrated solar power plants. And there are a lot of factors that are taken into consideration: the environmental, the social, and the economics. And at a glance, you can quickly see that there's a combination of those non-core technical skills as well as technical skills. People with geoscience skills who are dealing with the environment, who are dealing with the geology, the terrain, the nature of the locations where we're going to site our solar plant, in addition to other things like what is the kind of irradiation that we have in those areas. Those kind of skills come in selecting what would be the best site to put our solar PV power plant. Okay, so someone with a geoscience skill can easily move into this space, apply the knowledge and the background that they've had, bring in expertise in GIS mapping, just put all of that together and select best sites for which we can put in our solar PV plants. When we go into wind, especially offshore wind, we see a lot of the skills that drilling engineers have. Now, drilling engineers that have dealt with the offshore environment, rig selection, considering the waves, considering the wind, considering currents, trying to identify what kind of rig is most suitable for a depth and the kind of turbulence that they expect. These are things that come naturally to them. And so when we want to go into things like offshore wind, what kind of platforms do we want to use? How do we, what kind of water depths are we dealing with? What kind of systems are going to operate best at these water depths with this kind of wind, waves, and currents? The same skills that one uses in, planning and designing offshore drilling activities are the same kind of skills that are brought in for offshore wind platforms, okay? And it's not only on the design part, we have the design part, the engineering part, but also the operations. And so the skills that are needed or have been used as a drilling engineer, operating drilling rigs, offshore platforms for the oil and gas industry are very relevant to the offshore wind industry. In another example, I just bring in this figure. And the reason why I bring this figure is that it has some terms that are very similar to what we see in the oil and gas industry. So in the geothermal space, we go through the process of exploration, appraisal, development, production, and maintaining the life of this field. Okay, reservoir management, additional drilling, just some sort of rejuvenation. We see that very similar to the oil and gas industry. And so I cannot go into all the details, but at this high level, it's very clear that anyone who has skills as someone in the oil and gas industry can find a place in geothermal resource development at different stages in the life cycle. Okay, what would just be needed is understanding of the kind of fluids we're dealing with, the intricacies, combining things like heat with flow, and what kind of organisms or what's the peculiarity of the things we'll find in the subsurface and the challenges we'll see producing due to the fact that we're producing hot liquid from the subsurface. So those are the kind of add-ons that one will need to know as you move into the space from the oil and gas industry. Now, one would think that people from the oil and gas industry don't have any role to play when it comes into fuel cells. But in designing a hydrogen polymer electrolyte membrane fuel cell, we need to be able to select what are the best materials that will make the membrane. And understanding what kind of materials involves flow in porous media. So people who have spent time understanding flow through porous media, flow through rocks, going into those micro and nano scale to understand things that are going on in the subsurface. Those kind of skills are very relevant as we begin to understand what are the best kind of materials that will be needed for the polymer electrolyte membrane fuel cells. So those same skills that have been used in the oil and gas industry can be transferred. The kind of modeling, the kind of selection, the kind of equations, is the same physical principles that have been used that are also used in designing and selecting these membranes for the fuel cells. And then we go into the carbon capture, utilization, and storage value chain. So at the top here, I put this figure that talks about how we get the CO2 from its source. It's captured. Once it's separated, we compress it, we find ways of transporting it. And then after transportation, we think about storing it in the subsurface or other means, or find ways of utilizing it. Now, if I go into what does it take to store CO2 in the subsurface in geologic bodies, we go through pre-assessment. We need to know if a site is suitable for CO2 storage, whether it has this sufficient capacity, injectivity, does it have anything like fracture that would prevent us from, that can easily be reopened when we begin to inject fluids? Is there a secondary containment in the event that we have a leak from the first setup or the primary containment? We go through that. We bring in things like, what are the other environmental and economic constraints? Are there certain land areas that we should not even attempt storing CO2? Are there high risk of losing the CO2 through faults and existing wells? So we take all those things into consideration. Then we move on to the stage of permitting. And to get a permit involves a lot of information about preparing. You need to have a model of what you're trying to do. You need to understand the terrain where you're going to do it. You need to also look out, plan your injection strategies, identify how far your fluid is going to move, that's the CO2 in the subsurface. You need to be able to show from a financial perspective, but from a technical perspective as well, that there is no harm that is going to be generated due to CO2 storage in the subsurface. And all of these things we talk here, when I talk about capacity, it's just like assessing reserves. It's the same thing that people in the oil and gas industry have been doing for years. Injectivity, we inject, but at the same time, we also produce. So we talk about productivity. So these are things that people in the oil and gas industry are very familiar with. And it's just bringing it to deal with a different kind of fluid in the same subsurface that they're very comfortable with. Then we move on to things like the CO2 plume monitoring. On the surface and in the subsurface, we need to be able to monitor what's happening with the CO2. And that's where we bring in so much of the expertise that we've had in the oil and gas industry. It could be seismic monitoring, it could be downhole monitoring, reservoir saturation monitoring, using fiber optics, and then the use of numerical models. The list is not exhaustive, but these are things that people in the oil and gas industry are used to doing. And so their skills will be very relevant here. When we look at the hydrogen value chain, there is the section of storage, which is a small part of things, storage in salt caverns, and people are investigating in porous media. But if we look at the whole value chain, we talk about, conversion of hydrogen from one form, from an initial form, maybe through electrolysis, maybe through steam methane reforming. We use it for electricity generation, or through refining, or, generation of ammonia. There are several uses of hydrogen. And then overall, we find ways of transporting it for final use. So this looks like we are towards the midstream and downstream portion of the E&P value chain. And so the skills that are needed in that area are easily transferable here. So as we begin to think about the hydrogen economy, we also need to understand that the skills that have been utilized in the E&P industry will be relevant in the hydrogen space as well. So how do we bring all of this together? What a couple of us did was we took the existing competency matrix of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and then we checked those for each of these aspects of the low carbon energy space or the evolving energy mix. What skills do we have in the petroleum engineering skill set that will be utilized here? And we mapped it for the geoscience, formation evaluation, drilling and well completions, reservoir engineering, well production, subsurface facilities, or surface production and facilities, and offshore technologies. And we see that all of these, in one way or the other, has something related to the different aspects of the energy mix. Very interestingly, we saw that things like the underground energy storage, CCUS, especially the storage aspect of it, geothermal energy, they really had a lot of the skills that we use as petroleum engineers and geoscientists in the oil and gas. What we use in the oil and gas industry is applicable to these spaces. There are some other cases where we have the skills, but it wasn't as much as we saw in this top three here. And so if anyone is thinking about upskilling or reskilling, on this slide, I list different pathways for doing that. On my x-axis is what's the time commitment. This is relative from 1 to 5. So 1 is low, 5 is very high. And then on the y-axis is the cost as well. as it is today. We don't know how the cost of education will change tomorrow. Then the size of the bubble is what depth of knowledge are you going to get by getting yourself involved in each of these things. And so here we've had technical meetings, self-study, attending technical workshops, having technical mentorship, attending short courses, certificate programs, and advanced degrees. And so for each individual, you need to ask yourself, what do I really want to gain? Do I need to know just high level, or do I need to go in depth? How much time do I have available to be able to upskill and reskill? What's better for me in terms of cost? Do I have the funding either personally or through some sort of scholarship or elsewhere? Or is this something that I could just log into one meeting, listen to this talk, and learn one or two things? So there are different pathways for upskilling, and these are things that we have listed here. It's also not exhaustive, but just a few that we have compiled here. So to summarize, several aspects of the energy mix require the skills and domain expertise that we see in the oil and gas industry. So the core technical and non-core technical skills are transferable and in some cases interchangeable with different degrees of learning. I use the word interchangeable because someone who has done a couple of things in offshore wind may find relevance or may be able to fit into offshore drilling, but would have to upskill in terms of fundamentals. Okay. Geothermal energy, carbon storage, and underground energy storage, as we have seen, have large rating for transferability of the oil and gas skills, both petroleum and geoscience. And one other thing that was very interesting to see was that the geoscience skills cut across several aspects of the energy transition. It's something that is very broad. We are looking at the environmental part, we're looking at the geology part, there's the geophysics part, there's the mining part, understanding rocks and rock properties, etc. So it really cuts across so many of the different components of our evolving energy mix. So I'll just thank you so much for listening to my talk. Please let me know if you have any questions, if you want to discuss. I'm more than happy to address any questions or concerns. Thank you so much.